In testing in 2023, Aston Martin came out of the blocks to impress. The whole of Formula One seems to think that Aston Martin are, if not title contenders, about to leap up to join the top three in Formula One. I personally have doubts that they will suddenly pop up as a top three team, like most people seem to think that they will. But let's dig into the scale of what that achievement would be. Mid-regulation, they are going to jump up from 7th in the championship, allegedly, to suddenly being competing for race wins, for giving the likes of Ferrari and Mercedes a bloody nose week on week. I am slightly skeptical of that. If Aston Martin finish this season in the top three of Formula One, it will be the most phenomenal off-season mid-regulation performance of the century. If they do it, well done, but I have my doubts. Now, do we think in this panel, is anybody buying the Aston Martin hype? Who's most on the Aston Martin hype train? Chris,
Okay.
Chris, you think they're going to win the championship?
No, I think that if there is still a small gap at the beginning of the season between Red Bull and Ferrari and then Mercedes, that is somewhat bridging the gap between the top three in the midfield, then Aston Martin are going to be the ones closest to the top three. Even if there isn't quite as big a gap between...
I don't even agree with that.
Those top two teams of Mercedes, I think Aston will be the ones that are leading the midfield charge and maybe just starting to bridge that gap ever so slightly. And I think the reason that you're able to see something like this now is because of the cost cap, which, it's taken a couple of years to kind of actually show the effect of it. But now you're seeing the quality of the team itself, not just who spends the most money. And, we've seen it with Mercedes, how, even this team that has been utterly dominant in Formula One for the last 8 years royally screwed things up last year. And that cost cap is not really allowing them to chuck money at the solution like they normally would do. Enter a team like Aston Martin that has been investing so much in their resources and in their infrastructure to be the ones that can make that stride forward.
So what you're saying is Aston Martin being able to spend up to the limit of the cost cap means that they can compete with all the teams that also choose to adhere with the limits of the cost cap.
It's the additional investment that team has had since it was Force India, Racing Point, whatever, but it's more the top three teams being pulled back in terms of that money they can spend.
Yeah, and it's not at all down to Aston's accountants simply being slightly more clever than Red Bull's accountants, another area in which they have copied the current World Championship team.
Well, that too.
There are rumors about exactly how much Aston is getting away with under the cost cap because their accountants are better. But I leave that aside for a moment and I ask you a much simpler question. If we start with the idea that every team improves between the end of last season and the beginning of this season, and then we double it for Aston because they have Dan Fallows and they have Alonso. Alpine. That still puts them well behind Mercedes. Look at how bad Mercedes looked last test. Was any midfield team really close to them over the course of the season? No, not at all. I mean, maybe every now and then when things went wrong, but no midfield team came close.
I think that's
Aston is not going to close that gap in a single season. It just is not going to happen. And we know things about some of the other midfield teams. Because now I'm going to make it all about Alpine.
There's an Alpine segment. Just make it about
Alpine. I'll leave it for then. I'm just getting anxious to get it in there because it's really exciting, but completely unconfirmed. So it's going to be the most interesting thing to watch on Friday, I think. But fine, go ahead.
Come on.
I'll be brief, and then you can fanboy on Alpine all you like. So, two things for Aston Martin. I think their catering department must have a lot of photocopiers in it. But the second thing is just think of what this is going to mean. If they go from 7th in the championship up to 4th, their column 2 payments at the end of the season are going to go up by about $20 million. which is a massive thing for a little team like this, particularly as they're trying to finance making a massive new factory just outside Silverstone. So it's going to be a real help to them if they can get that.
It's not little team though, is it, in terms of the amount of money that they can spend out on things that don't involve the cost cap, because Stroll is like the richest person in the world.
Yeah,
okay?
it's
still
That's
Jordan.
20 million.
Hang on, no. Stroll could buy F1 if you wanted to.
He really could.
Yeah.
That is chump change, my friend.
It's still Jordan in my eyes. Come on.
They still Force India.
Yeah,
Still Force
exactly.
India. Okay, Trumpets.
I was going to say the brains of Force India seem to have landed in another outfit, but that's just me. Yeah, no, I was going to argue with the idea that Aston is now a quote unquote tiny team. They are anything but. They're funded to the hilt. They are using all the loopholes and all of the knowledge and building brand new facilities to try and catch.
Wait a
And
minute.
fair play
You
to them,
seem,
Mercedes
you,
and Red Bull and Ferrari.
you seem very.
I just don't see that happening in a single season.
You seem very enthusiastic about Aston Martin all of a sudden. Have you had one of Lawrence Stroll's dinners? You can I think you can track what F1 media have had a dinner at the Stroll mansion because you can just see a sudden uptick, and it's the same rhetoric. Lawrence Stroll is amazing. Everything Lawrence Stroll does turns to gold. He was once locked in a cellar with a ball of yarn, and with a simple spinning wheel turned it into a pool of gold, and then he made everyone guess his name, and no one got him, and he danced off into the sunset and made Tommy Hilfiger. That's the narrative, Catman, that everyone just spins, and like you can see the same language. He's magnificent. Everything he does succeeds. He's got a massive head.
Absolutely. I think that is absolutely right, because have you ever seen that man look angry? It would make you lose about 5 inches in height, just the withering looks that man can give. I don't think it's the fact that he's buying them dinner. I think they just don't want to get on his bad side.
If you ever hear me starting to go down that same path, just feel happy because you know that I've had a nice day out at the Stroll mansion. All right, well, I think Matt wants to talk some Alpine, so let's do that. Alpine have set the stall out as they bring up Western Europe's biggest challenge to motorsport history. The French outfit is ready to conquer the mountains with Pierre Gasly and Esteban Ocon to combat the English archers. I don't know, just trying to make a medieval war reference, but I'm gonna abandon it. Alpine has Matt's favourite driver in it, which is Esteban Ocon. He is facing, in my opinion, a massive challenge from Pierre Gasly. You have assured me that there's good noises coming out of Alpine. On the surface, they've hidden it well. They are a team, like Mercedes, that tend to kind of hold it a little bit back in testing, but my goodness, I mean, they look like they must be really holding it back.
Well, yeah. And this, to me, this is the biggest and most fascinating story of testing. Alpine clearly, maybe not the absolute fastest, because I think the McLaren and Norris was a bit faster than them. But with the two drivers they had, Alonso and Ocon, clearly the fourth place team. No doubt about that. They won that. They brought developments every single race, and they have hewn their own path through these regulations. They're not copying Red Bull. They're not copying Ferrari. They're looking to both for inspiration, but they have their own ideas, and they followed them and executed them and achieved, sort of their goal, which was fourth place for last season. Here's what I've learned that makes me fascinated. 1, weight. They have cut so much weight from this car that they have effectively the ability to move ballast around wherever they want to put it. And now, given the fact that the tires have added 2 kilograms, the power unit have added 1 kilogram, and the weight has stayed the same at 798 kilograms.
Numbers.
That's a remarkable achievement. 2, they've massively improved the cooling, which means that their power unit from Viry now has more power to it. I don't think we saw them running it at anything close to its maximum, but cooler air equals better combustion equals more power at the wheels where you need it. So we've got the weight and we've got the power. But what the technical director, Matt Harmon, was most proud of was the rebuild of the rear suspension. And he mentioned two things. One, that they would have a ride height tool that would allow them to run lower to the ground, which means more downforce for less drag. And two, that they would have similar technology that would allow them to run stiffer platforms, which means that the aerodynamics of that car will be better compared to cars that have to run softer to cope with things like curbs and this and that and the other, which explains why, in my mind, why we saw them looking so skittish all the time. Essentially, they were running very stiff suspension settings to test for races further down the road. And the last...
Yeah, no, go on. That just seems high risk to me, and that seems a lot like what Mercedes were doing last year, where it was like, no, it's okay, everything's fine, it's just this is a particularly bumpy track. But they were saying that two races out of 3.
Well, and like we know, for example, in an Ocon stint, that one of the reasons why they didn't run so many laps, and remind me if we have time before the end, and I'll just run through who ran the most laps and this, that, and the other. They didn't run a lot of laps because the setup changes they were doing took more time than anticipated, but they're testing like really out suspension settings. They have an entire new rear end. They have entirely new settings available to them. They didn't have last season. And I think they were just testing outliers that computer simulations found for them to see if there was anything special in there. They didn't care about lap time at all. They know they've got it in the bag because the car is so light. And the last thing is they've got an update coming to Bahrain. So they're going to have an even better package than we saw this week in testing.
I think the big thing for Alpine needs to be the reliability as well, because if there's anything that almost cost them 4th in the championship, apart from McLaren fighting that battle with only one car, is that their reliability very nearly cost them in a number of races. So I think if they can get that sorted and keep the same amount of speed, then they are a pretty deadly package in that midfield battle.